going to start today with healthcare. Um, and the best way that we thought we could kick it off is just to kind of ground it a bit with all of our doctors, our medical doctors, that are a part of the IDSG. So is there a doctor in the house? No, but I would love to have Dr. Tom and any of our other doctors to help us in kind of setting the stage for the rest of the morning. Thank you.
You know, I'll start off with a little bit of an attempt at humor. First of all, I'm Tom Sullivan. I'm a cardiologist, been taking care of patients for 40 years. I got a lot of experience, and that's what I know best. It's not all the high-tech and digital stuff, but I remember once, it was just a couple of years after I had gotten my boards in cardiology, I was on a plane coming back from a conference from LA to Boston, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, it was one of those red eyes, an announcement comes over, is there a doctor on the plane? And so, young cardiologist, I jump up, run, and see in the aisle this man laying on the floor in the middle of the aisle. And so I kneel down beside him, and he has no pulse, and I said, are you okay? And he says, yeah, I'm just feeling really weak, and I can't feel his pulse. And I'm saying, okay, well, this is what I've been trained for. And the woman sitting in the seat right on the edge of the aisle, she says to me, as I'm examining him, what kind of doctor are you? And I said, well, I'm a cardiologist. I said, oh, thank God, he's an OBGYN. It's my husband. Fortunately, it turned out okay, but it was some moments of crisis. Anyway, I just have a couple of minutes to give the lead off on. I'm the chair of the Healthcare Industry Committee for IDESG, and I'm very proud to be part of this whole effort of NSTIC. All our members are enthusiastic about implementing the NSTIC principles. But I just want to set up a little, since our next speaker is going to talk about privacy, some of the issues. I was chair of the main privacy committee at Partners Healthcare in Boston for the past 12 years. We recently disbanded because there's a whole reorganization, and we're moving to Epic as opposed to a homegrown sort of Harvard teaching hospital electronic medical record. But it's we have a continuing tension and dilemma, or a conundrum, of trying to protect the individual's privacy, and we strongly, strongly believe in that, and yet foster interoperability and the sharing of records where it's appropriate, as some people might say in the HIPAA language, TPO, treatment, payment, and operations. We need to share those records and need to think of the considerations of public health. And I'm actually happy Bill Braithwaite is sitting in the audience here, and he was participating in our breakout session between our healthcare committee and the privacy committee at the end of the afternoon yesterday, in which he pointed out that the very similar dilemmas that he faced when he was writing the HIPAA privacy rule back from 1998 to 2003, in that era, very similar discussions going on today, and that's going to be a constant tension. And I brought up the case of some of you, if you've studied any public health or epidemiology, and certainly every medical student learns about Typhoid Mary. I don't know, how many people in the audience have ever heard of the name Typhoid Mary? Okay, so we got a fair amount. So if you, and I just brought it up on the cuff yesterday during our discussion, but when I went back to the hotel last night, I looked up a few more facts to make sure I get it straight, because she sort of illustrates, I don't want to make the analogy too strict, she sort of illustrates the problem. Now, she was born in 1869, immigrated from Ireland to New York, died in 1938. The last 30 years of her life she spent in isolation, in old-fashioned quarantine isolation in a small hospital area in New York, where she lived most of her career. She was an asymptomatic, one of the first identified and proven asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever, a salmonella infection. And she was perfectly healthy, but she spread this illness because she was a cook. She was employed as a cook in a number of wealthy families in other areas in the New York City and Long Island area. And it's estimated that about 51 people got very sick and 3 people died. Now, there were many other typhoid Marys, but she was the case that became most famous because people felt sorry for her. And they confined her, and she adamantly refused until she died that, one, her privacy had to be protected, and she was healthy, and she couldn't understand. She didn't like the doctors. She was very suspicious. They kept telling her she had a condition, and she was a public health hazard. So what did she end up doing after she was first identified? She started being anonymous. She used pseudonyms so she could maintain her privacy in her own life. And then when she was, after her first confinement, they felt sorry for her because this was not a disease that she did something to contract and wasn't willfully spreading it until they thought later on. And so they said, well, we'll let you out of the hospital if you promise not to be a cook anymore. You wash your hands, and that's it. So she had to go to work as a laundress, and it didn't pay as well as being a cook. So she secretly, again, changed her name and went back to being a cook, and of course, spread the salmonella again. And I illustrate that because, you know, although this happened at the turn of the last century, it encapsulates in true story, you know, the dilemma of privacy, pseudonyms, and the needs of the public health, and we face that today. So those are some of the things that we're trying to grapple with in a digital era that encapsulates the NSTIC principles. I'll just mention a couple of other quick things. I had the honor of being the president of the Massachusetts Medical Society about 10 years ago. It's the oldest medical society in the country. We're 233 years old. We used to give out the licenses. We used to discipline the doctors many years ago. We petitioned the state of Massachusetts to start the first Department of Public Health, the State Department of Public Health in the United States. And, you know, when I think about trust marks today, I say, well, gee, I have this thing after my name. It says MD, and we put it up on the wall, and that's our little trust mark. But there are lots of other little trust marks, too, today. And JACO, or the Joint Commission, gives a trust mark to hospitals that said, you say you meet our standards. So, again, we're grappling with some of the things. How do we get to digital trust marks in healthcare? How do we say, okay, it's not enough to have that MD after your name on the wall? And once again, everything new is old, or everything old is new. We're repeating, and so we cannot forget the lessons of history. So, just with that brief introduction, thank you. And is Joy here, or is our next speaker? Oh, okay, there she is. Okay, so I'll finish with that unless somebody has a quick question, want to talk about us. But our members are really, and members are enthusiastic about implementing NSTIC principles. And Bill also is the chair of a recently formed committee at HIMSS on identity management. And there are several of us who sort of cross-pollinate those committees. So we're working pretty closely with the HIMSS task force, and hopefully that'll get more of the private sector involved. So once again, thank you very much, and I guess Jeremy's going to come up and introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the plenary. I'm real excited our next speaker was able to come. A little bit of background on the relationship our office has had with ONC. I first started this job, I think it was February 2011, and somewhere in the first month I got this email, this frantic email at 3 in the morning from Anish Chopra, who some of you may remember was President Obama's first chief technology officer, and it was addressed to me and Farzad Mostashari, who was the C in ONC, the coordinator, basically introducing the two of us and saying, as we've talked about many times, in order to enable all the benefits of electronic health records, we need to solve the identity conundrum. The White House is about to launch this big national initiative on trusted identity that's at the center of it. You two should really talk, because it'd be silly if something was developed for healthcare only in a silo that didn't actually align with and interoperate with this broader national identity ecosystem that we're looking to create. And in the early meetings we had with ONC, I think the very first person I met beyond Farzad was Joy. Joy's the Chief Privacy Officer. She's been there, I don't have a formal bio, a little over 4 years? 4.5 years. And has really been a great friend and ally and a good person to bounce stuff off of. And we've had a really nice working relationship between the offices the last couple of years. So I was really excited that I could get her to come to this plenary when we're in D.C. and give some of her thoughts in terms of how important it is, both in terms of solving the broader identity conundrum in healthcare, as well as how important trusted identities are in order to protect the privacy of patients and patients' health information. Joy, sadly, for me at least, just announced that she'll be leaving ONC shortly. You have a date?
Yes,
July 12th, so we got her for about another 3 weeks or so. But she was kind enough to come talk today, and she'll give some good remarks, and then we'll have a nice panel talking about more about what we need to do around healthcare and electronic health records with trusted identities. So please welcome Joy.
Good morning. Thank you, Jeremy. And I want to assure you all that although Joy is leaving July 12th, ONC remains very committed to this, to NSTIC and the work that you are doing. Jeremy did a very good introduction in setting up how we came to be involved with NSTIC. And we were very excited to hear about this, first of all, the strategy, and then all of the work that has happened since then. As I'm sure most of you know, there have been major changes in the healthcare field in the last year or so, well, I guess it's several years now, through both high-tech and the Affordable Care Act. And what we're doing is we're really moving this healthcare industry from what I've jokingly called about the 19th or early 20th century, where everything's done in paper and passed around, to modernism, where it's all electronic. And not only is it electronic, but there is also a continuing shift from this care being what we would call provider-centered to patient-centered. That it is very important that the information follow the patient wherever they go. You can imagine and many of you know the type of challenges that this presents. One of the major projects that ONC has been involved in, initiatives, has been hand in hand with CMS through the HITECH Act in incentivizing healthcare providers to adopt electronic health records. There are over 500,000 medical doctors in this country alone. That doesn't include other healthcare providers. So you can see the large population that we're talking about. Most of those providers practice in more than one setting, and that's becoming even more common today. Every setting that they practice in, they need to have ID proofing done and credentials issued. It's kind of crazy. You talk to some of these doctors and they have a handful of PIV cards or things like that, or they have to memorize all of these different passwords in order to get their basic job of providing health care done. That's frankly crazy. Now we're turning also to the patient side of things, and there have been a number of efforts that have been done both through the HITECH Act and through the Affordable Care Act to really put the emphasis more on the patient and making sure that the individual not only has the information centered around them, but they also have access to it directly. Now, this is a right that's been around for many years. It's part of the fair information practices that go back to the 1970s under the Health, Education, and Welfare initial report that started a lot of the fair information practices. And it was definitely incorporated under HIPAA. Yet many years later, we still have healthcare providers reluctant to provide patients with access to their own health information. One of the key items that we hear, the concerns that we hear from doctors, is that I don't know if I'm giving it to the right person. I feel uncomfortable. I don't know where this information's going. And until we solve that problem, we're going to have continued reluctance of sharing this information with the person that it's about, the patient. There are over, I believe, let me think about this. I think there's over 240 million people in the United States that are over the age of 18. Every one of those people is going to be a patient at some point, and most of them will be required to see multiple providers. We're hoping that every one of those providers furnishes patients access with their own information, but in the short term, what they're doing is they're creating portals, which means that right now an individual might have a number of different portals that they have to log on to in order to get their health information. It's the same issue, but with a different population. And in some ways, it's a little bit more complicated because at the provider level, you all at least have professional organizations that check their credentials and verify who they are. And patients are a little bit more complicated. We have complicated that issue even a little bit more this year with amendments that HHS made to the HIPAA privacy rule and the Clinical Laboratory Improvements Act, fondly known as CLIA. And under those rules, we expanded patients' rights of access, a direct right of access, to include clinical labs, which were originally excluded under HIPAA. It does present a challenge to clinical laboratories, though, because unlike a lot of your medical doctor, you go in and you see them, sometimes clinical labs don't have that direct relationship with the patient. They have the relationship with the patient's blood sample, perhaps, but they have not met the patient. So that they have a challenge, even a greater challenge than most doctors do in verifying that this individual is who they say they are, this information belongs to them, and I should really be giving this person access to their information. So as we can see, there are a lot of use cases out here where this identification of both providers and patients is just really essential. Our office has been addressing these issues through a number of different forums. We work very closely with a couple of federal advisory committees, including the Health Information Technology Policy Committee. And they've made recommendations to us over the years surrounding provider authentication, particularly that the level of assurance for provider ID when a provider is accessing information off premises, they call it remotely, should be LOA 3, because when a provider is on premises, you can verify who they are in person. But when they're off premises, they're using a remote device or something, it makes it difficult. They've also made recommendations that they believe that password, username and password is not ideal for patients. That's no surprise, given that that's just the general rule of thumb and where things are heading in the entire industry. But they are recommendations that come over to HHS, and then we take them under consideration. They've also been very involved with NSTIC when they're making these recommendations. NSTIC has presented on a number of occasions, both to the Policy Committee and to the Standards Committee, which is the committee that makes recommendations to HHS based on what they think the standards should be going forward. And they very thoughtfully are looking at where this effort is headed and when the right time to move might be on making specific recommendations. So to date, they've been reviewing things, but they're in kind of a wait and hold. They're waiting to see what you all are doing. And so I'm going to put the pressure on you now because it's really important that we make progress in this area. Time is passing. More people are adopting these records. More people are getting access to their information online. And we're really getting to the point where it's very crucial that we be able to do this in a more uniform and easy way. Because as we all know, if we don't make it easy, if we don't make security easy, people won't do it. So I'm going to leave you with that charge for your work this afternoon, or later today, including this morning right after I speak, I guess. And I wish you, I'm very glad that to see the people who are involved with this effort, particularly in the healthcare sector. It's very important work you're doing because policy work, don't get me wrong, policy work is hard. But what you all do, which is making that policy work actually come into reality, is even harder. And we appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for helping us kick off this whole conversation around healthcare. In a former life, I was actually working on a PhD in health policy, and I spent my time trying to deal with information asymmetry, trying to figure out how a patient could have some level of power in talking to a doctor. That was before WebMD was created and other types of things. I'm kind of glad because I learned post-WebMD that I was a hypochondriac. The more I had access to information, the more illnesses I could figure out that I had. So not necessarily the greatest thing, but the whole concept of being able to have more access to information, to be able to talk about your own medical records and to have other physicians to have information that they could share with each other is all so interrelated. And so what we wanted to do next is to have actually a panel discussion. And so I am actually not the moderator of the panel. Jim. Oh. So are we ready to have our panel? And you want to come up? Okay, so we're going to have a panel conversation, a panel discussion. Jim Scher is going to be the moderator, but we're going to also have Debbie Bucci from ONC, Don Tebow, that's going to talk about OpenID Connect and how that has a relationship to healthcare. And Adrian Groper from Patient Privacy Rights to also add more conversation around healthcare and privacy and the issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim, for that nice introduction, and thanks again to Joy for providing that great high-level overview on the real need in health IT for basically a solution for this identity conundrum that affects multiple sectors, but which I think health IT feels very keenly, and especially in what we see at ONC in terms of how they are thinking about how electronic health records will work online, how they're shared, and how patients face this problem of having to log into multiple health sites to manage their information in future. So thanks again, Joy, for providing that high-level overview. One thing we do at NSTIC, as Jeremy mentioned, is coordinate with other agencies. And so this ongoing project with ONC to work together and how we can collaborate to advance NSTIC in the health sector has offered great opportunities to work with stakeholders in that space on innovative new projects. So our panel today consists of Debbie Bucci, who has taken on a lead role at ONC in identity issues. Don Tebow needs no introduction, of course, at OIX, long active in this space. And Adrian kindly here as well to provide a privacy perspective and hopefully share some insights. I look forward to his insights on the contribution of the IDSG and this unique community in the work going forward. So I think our format will be, brief introductions, and then we'll turn it into a nice Q&A session so we can dig into this further. So Debbie, would you like to lead us off?
Okay. So hello, my name is Debbie Bucci, and for those of you who know me, I'm very much a doer. It was Jeremy that introduced me to Joy, and that is how I got to ONC in the first place. I cut my teeth in her office. She's very much, I had no idea what policy was, but it was an eye-opener to see how policy actually affects the standards and the work that is done within ONC and across the nation. So for the last year, I have actually gone back to my roots, and I am in the standards group that focuses on the architecture And there has been, for those of you in healthcare, there has been a desire for quite some time to have that, in addition to the SOA-based infrastructures and the S-MIME for direct, to move to more restful approaches. And given some of the work that the policy committees that had worked towards, they were looking at restful solutions. And in October of 2013, the HIT Standards Committee suggested that the use of what they're calling the Blue Button APIs, which is built on OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, and FHIR, which they call Fast Health Interoperable Resources, was a good foundation of making RESTful type applications. It was interesting that the initial focus was for consumer-based, patient-centric type of interactions, but they quickly realized not just for patient interactions, but also for general health exchange, that it was a good approach. And part of that recommendation was to do pilots based on those RESTful types of approaches. So recently, ONC has sponsored, of course the focus is on FHIR. For those, FHIR is, I'm sure there's other policies and implementations, but essentially it's HTTP with Atom, and you could use a JSON or an XML. So it's very simple, web-based, easy to access. So we started I had been talking with other agency partners to possibly collaborating on a pilot. And so I have been talking with the innovation team in VA that has focused on another missing piece, and that is they had put a lot of work and effort in the idea of patient consent. Now, patient consent, as I understand it from a web-based, is you consent to your information, but it's much more in the healthcare. There is the sense of the patient consent directives and how is that expressed. And certainly there has been a lot of work done in your ABAC, EXACTML world. So how do you stretch that and take it and make it a RESTful approach? So they're looking at expressing consent using the FHIR resources. So that adds another protocol. If OAuth is the RESTful beginning, and you build OpenID Connect that adds the identity, then possibly a way to express consent may be UMA, the user access management, if I have that right. So we're just in the beginning of the discussions. We're just beginning to talk about what that use case would be, but we're very excited because it's the opportunity of taking SOAP, maybe direct, and adding RESTful to possibly demonstrate a pilot that is truly interoperable. That's it.
Thank you. I have to correct Jim because I do need an introduction in this case because I'm really speaking on behalf of the OpenID Foundation, which is a standards development organization that's really focused on interoperable open standards for identity on the web. I was so struck by what Ms. Pitts had to say because it's so familiar. If you think about what she noted was that we have to construct these hubs, these HIEs, these health portals, and they are reminiscent of a similar kind of construct with the attribute exchange networks that are being built in other sectors. The key thing about that is how do we manage the interaction between the patient and the prescriber, et cetera, all the people in that chain with this new hub. We have to somehow manage the identity and the interaction of one's identity in the context of these exchanges in a trusting and privacy protecting and secure way. That's a whole lot like the work that's being done with the mobile network operators today. They have to construct these hubs so that they can interoperate, so they can serve their subscribers. The other thing that Joy mentioned, which I thought was so key, was that we have to construct a system, build the plumbing for a system that speaks to the relationship between a patient and a prescriber and perhaps ultimately a prescription online when the patient has never met the portal, has never met their prescription workflow. And much less we have to build a system where the patient trusts those new portals and new prescribers that may be part of that workflow. In the same way that a patient has to build a trust relationship in this new flow, it talks about the very same issues that are being piloted, tested, and plumbed, if you will, in the mobile network space and certainly the social media place, where all these different industry sectors are focused on the same fundamental issue, whether it's a patient, a citizen, or a customer. You heard me yesterday say that I think the pivot point, the common denominator between the health issues that we heard about this morning, the interaction between the platform of choice, the mobile device, and the person is really, in my view, the pivot point, the keystone is, if you will, is user consent and permissioning, patient consent and permissioning, citizen consent and permissioning. So with that being said, now we talk about the really boring stuff, the plumbing stuff, the standard stuff, the work that Debbie is expert in, and the interaction and policy that Adrian is expert in. I represent the really boring stuff, the plumbing that sits underneath that, the open standards. And I think Deb did a good job of kind of talking about the evolution of these open standards, beginning with OAuth 2.0, moving to OpenID Connect, and recently with the official acceptance of OpenID Connect, we now have a standard, a piece of plumbing that I would guess most people in this room is using without knowing. If you use Gmail or Yahoo or AOL, you are using OpenID Connect. That's the plumbing layer that allows for the interaction between a customer, citizen, patient, hopefully, and this portal or this identity provider. It's very exciting because OpenID Connect is architected deliberately with specific kind of call-outs for plumbing so that it can be optimized on the mobile device, so that it can be optimized in the environment that Deb described, where the attributes and the payload of the enrollment or the identity provider can be understood, can be standardized, and can be adapted for these different environments. So I think we're at a really exciting point where by looking at healthcare, we're also beginning to consider the commonality between healthcare and consent and permissioning on the mobile devices in your pockets and the identities that you have online. To the extent that those identities online, be they a Gmail provided email address or a Yahoo address or others, we begin to have an architecture in place, the base plumbing, to accomplish the kind of work that Joy described, that Deb began to outline. So I think we're at a particularly important point where we have the base protocols, OpenID Connect, available for the development in the way that Deb just described, and the scrutiny of policymakers like Adrian and others who can begin to look at those workflows, that information flow, and determine not only is it secure, is it privacy enhancing, but also is it easy to use. Easy to use is really important because that's the pivot point. That's what Facebook cares about just as much as the VA cares about. It wants to make it easy to use, but yet build trust. So that's the task before us, and I'll yield to my colleague to introduce himself as well.
This is the place. IDESG is really the game in town to solve this very complex problem of enhancing cybersecurity and privacy at the same time. The reason that patient privacy rights, that I've been a huge fan of what we're doing here, is because it is really the only forum that I'm aware of, and I've been doing standards work, interoperability work in healthcare for over 10 years, even before I became a advocate and working with a nonprofit. I'm basically from the vendor side. I'm a serial entrepreneur, an engineer at heart, and a physician only sort of by education. And this is where the very big problems that Joy introduced are going to get solved, because I'm not really aware, either from the vendor side or from the policy side of the groups that I've been able to interact with, of any other place. So what we're doing here is extremely important, and I think it's moving along well. We've had a couple of days to talk about how this is going to be, how our work here is going to be presented to the larger population. It has been said many times that citizens don't understand what identity is, and they won't necessarily care about it, and if they don't understand it, then the cybersecurity benefits of the technological innovations that we're introducing here are not going to be an easy sell. And so the role of healthcare and in this scenario is to link the actual benefits that patients and doctors, but primarily patients is the more interesting case, as Joy pointed out, to link those things which patients are interested in to the things that impact cybersecurity and impact the ability to scale all the way to solving an even bigger problem that hasn't been mentioned already, which is the big data problem. You know, how does one sort of manage the explosion, not just of mobile information that Don just mentioned, but also the fact that there's a $1,000 genome by the end of this year, which is less than some clinical lab tests are today. That kind of information all folds into sort of the promise of big data, but also the huge privacy issues and governance and policy issues that are being discussed in a couple of places, and more so. So we have two ways to connect identity to something that patients understand. One of them is consent, and the other one is notice. Now, those are two of the elements of fair information practice, and we can go into, and this is not a session, and there are people in this audience, I'm sure, understand what fair information practice is and the importance of the Privacy Committee and the work we're doing here with that has been well discussed. But specifically, as we move from the standards and the nitty-gritty issues that my colleagues have mentioned, what we're doing here is putting fair information practice to work in a way that patients will understand and value. And I'll just end by sort of introducing what I think is the pivotal work in that direction that was done in the healthcare work group over the last year and a half, which is what we call the healthcare use case. And the healthcare use case directly addresses this issue of moving from an institutional perspective, which is the portals, the multiple portals problem that Joy and Debbie both introduced, to a patient-centered vision where that is clearly the identity link to what's going on. And the healthcare use case was some very careful work that basically abstracted the three components of identity in healthcare: the service provider, the relying party, if you would, an aggregator of information. We call it the RLS. It stands for Relationship Locator Service, but it doesn't really matter. It's where data flows under consent, and it is the place that doesn't have that direct relationship with the patient because it is an aggregator. So it could be the lab stand-in that Joy mentioned. It could be the health information exchange that was mentioned by Don. It could be, some data broker that has been the subject of Federal Trade Commission scrutiny in the last month or so. And so the information flows from the relying party in healthcare to these aggregators, to these relationship locator services, and they have to manage identity for all the reasons that have all been mentioned. They have to provide the transparency that's required in order to have the basis of cybersecurity in our system, the notice that is required to make the whole system scale, and they have to collect the consent into a useful format that then serves the patient who is otherwise faced with dealing with the multiple portals and trying to figure out who actually knows what about whom. And I'll stop there. And
one thing to add, Debbie said in her introduction that she was a doer, and that's correct. And I say, blessed are the doers, for they shall inherit the ecosystem. Further add, Debbie's former colleague, Peter Alterman, said, and I agree with him, that the battle for internet identity in the U.S. will be driven by how it's played out in healthcare, and I think that's true. The opportunity, as I said before, is how do we manage a user-centric approach? How is that instantiated? And I think it would also be a consensus view in this room that we're in a world where technology is far outstripping the legal and the governance structures that we have. So I think Adrian's point is well made, that to the extent that this group can provide some leadership in a governance structure, how the rules of a user-centric identity approach match the tools that technology is providing us is really, to me, the most interesting part of our work. Call it user consent and notice. I think it all pivots around that user experience, and particularly emphasized when the user is a patient and when the data payload can often be a life or death or quality of life a difference. I think, to me, the key thing that the OpenID Foundation and its standards work can bring is that it is the touch point, call it a user-centric approach based on standards, where companies like Google or Microsoft or PayPal or the mobile network providers can at least find common cause or a common vocabulary in this user-centric approach. OpenID Connect importantly lays the foundation for that approach, but does not provide a prescriptive way for that to occur. So if we begin to look at the technology opportunity of building on an open standard like OpenID Connect, the protocols specific to patient permissioning, notice, and consent, we really do have an opportunity, as Adrian indicated, to provide some, not more conversation, but to move the conversation forward around healthcare and this identity ecosystem.
And I wasn't going to mention it, but user-centric, patient-mediated, patient at the center really turns that patient matching or identity matching issue on its ear, because the source of who that identity is starts with the one that knows. So I just think that's another piece of the puzzle that by changing the paradigm to be more patient-centric, it may help in those efforts as well.
Well, thanks. So I think a lot of food for thought there, and I hope we can have a ongoing healthy discussion, and we'll look to see if we have questions from the audience. If have this distinguished panel and a great opportunity. Back here, Kathy.
Thanks, Kathy Kilton. I may have missed it, but I didn't hear y'all mention anything about the role of caregivers and you know, for example, if you have an elderly parent or something like that. And could you just comment on how that complicates the overall identity situation?
I think for those of us that are in that pivot point between them taking care of us and us taking care of them, I think about my mother's situation, where we've carefully set up powers of attorney, medical power of attorney, etc. But at the end of the day, we all commit first-party fraud, where we go online or send an email or make a call representing that we are our mother, because she's too confused and we know that this is the right medication or the right appointment. So we somehow are forced to impersonate her in order to game the system. So we put caregivers, both those that have initials after their names and those that are sharing the same name, in this terrible paradox of having to commit fraud, first-party fraud, by impersonating the patient. And I think your point's well made, Kathy, about we've got to set up a system that has the frictionless user experience of Facebook with the consent and permissioning that advocates like Adrian and others rightfully insist upon.
Kathy, you're dead on, and this issue of delegation has been one of the things that has been in play for almost 4 years now. It was actually introduced in the beginning, in the first day when we created the Blue Button Initiative. This was a Markle meeting. It was initiated by the combination of the White House and the Veterans Administration. And in that meeting, the issue came up of when we were going to allow using Blue Button, and we invented the term Blue Button, the downloading of files of patient records from VA health record system, how we would prevent this breach of security, or how we would deal with this breach of security where people would be tempted and almost forced to impersonate family members. And that's where OAuth was actually first came to the fore, because it was in that meeting that, not OAuth by name, but the original guidelines for Blue Button basically said that best practice would be to include OAuth as a way of securing the interface from this perspective. And obviously we didn't get into federation issues and all of the interesting stuff that's going on now. Fast forward to 2014, when I'm doing my analyses of these architectures, these protocols that we do here and in the healthcare work group, I actually use the family giver use case as the core identity management test. I do not stop with the individual, because realistically, you know, 2/3 of the money that's spent on healthcare in this country is spent on 10% of the people. It's not 240 million patients, as Joy put it, it's 24 million or 30 million that actually are the focus of the economic activity and the issues. And most of those, maybe not all, but most of them are in family caregiver situations. So it is really a primary component of what drives at least the analyses that I do.
If you accept the hypothesis that I posited, that in the U.S. The healthcare use case is the tail that will wag the dog called identity, internet identity. And if you drill down farther, the epicenter of that is the blue button, because the blue button has become a meme as much as it's become anything else for ease of use. So to go from that abstraction.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I saw Kathy was back again. So.
She's not accepting this answer.
Yeah.
If you use the blue button as kind of the meme for where identity sits, and you use OAuth as kind of the starting point, it's interesting because you can go in several directions. But in OAuth 2, our friends at Facebook use OAuth 2, but they use a slight variant of it which protects a proprietary and closed system. A very powerful one that probably is the penultimate example of ease of use and adoption. But OAuth 2, that piece of plumbing that we keep talking about, and its successor, OpenID Connect, gives you that same opportunity for ease of use, but also control of the attributes that are part of the payload. So this plumbing layer that Deb's described and its application to healthcare aimed at the VA blue button is really how I kind of connect these blue dots.
So, and this is a personal belief, that the blue button API for REST has been in existence for at least a year now. But there's been this huge issue that data holders will not release their data. And I think OAuth 2 is a start, but it's enough. I don't think it's enough to express consent or express delegation or have express the additional policies on top to truly for a level of confidence for the data holder to be able to exchange data.
I think you may have actually answered my follow-on question, and that is, have you guys figured all this out? Or is that something that we as the organization need to try to help you figure out?
Boy, if we figured it out, it's news to me. But I think the question is, where does it get figured out? And my proposition is that wherever it gets figured out, it starts with a standard approach. If we don't take an open standards approach, we can do great things. Facebook, Apple, Oracle are examples of powerful economic and technology engines, but they are closed systems. It's interesting to see Apple begin to reassert interest in the healthcare space. But again, Apple, and I'm one of its users, is a proprietary system. Facebook is a powerful engine. I'm one of its users, but it's a proprietary system. So the transparency that we look for and the interoperability that we look for, I think, is the path forward.
No, we have not figured it out. And part of the reason that, part of the thing that stands in the way is the introduction of cross-sectoral federations into the large verticals, whether it's finance or healthcare, which obviously are represented, especially here. Both of them have different problems relative to cross-sectoral federations. But I dare say it's my opinion that the cybersecurity goal of NSTIC and the user centricity goal that I alluded to with respect to big data, and Don, sort of this link between where does clinical information under HIPAA end and mobile information and quantified self information that comes through your mobile begin. This is, we haven't cracked IDSG has not cracked this cross-sectoral issue. I think we're doing about as well as we could, though. The committee report outs yesterday showed a great deal of progress has been made in us organizing our work and you know, bringing through OpenID Foundation and other people, FIDO Alliance, et cetera, bringing people to the table to actually cross over into this cross-sectoral federation issue, but it hasn't been done yet.
Let's take a question here. Lisa, if I could give a quick introduction. Lisa Gallagher of HIMSS, a key stakeholder and one we're coordinating with closely in this project. Lisa.
Thank you, Jim. My question is for Debbie. Wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the upcoming ONC pilot, and if you can, you know, how and if it relates to some of these really tough questions we're talking about right now.
You'd like to hear a little bit more about
The pilot? Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, me too, Deb.
so of course the key, the buzzword is fire, but the interest is really around expressing consent and how can you do that. So the premise is right now we've had 2 or 3 initial discussions. We're throwing some use cases out. But in a very general way, we're calling it privacy on fire. And we're looking at 3 different use cases. One of them is HIE on fire. The second one is view, download, transmit, actually transmit on fire. And third, most importantly, I think interested for ONC is the multiple portal issue that has been generated by MU2. So it is that is why, as OAuth is the foundation and for the identity pieces, when you're interacting person to person versus system to system versus system to knowledge base, what level of how do you apply those policy and security pieces? And it's not clear. I mean, right now, for most of us technologists, we put privacy and security away to get it working. But I think we need to change that approach. I think if we could come up with what did I hear? Not make it hard. Come up with ways to make it easy, and hopefully this pilot will at least investigate that stuff. I mean, it's a lofty goal, but that's what we're thinking.
Let me make, Lisa, another comment about an opportunity with this pilot that is, I think, very important to accelerate the work that we're doing here in IDSG. In healthcare, and Joy can speak to this directly, we have the benefit of a couple of years of work on interoperability that is now part of a mandate. And HIMSS is obviously in the middle of this in a big way. But we have the direct, we have the transitions of care, we have view, download, transmit that are now the law and have gone into effect this year primarily, with slow but steady adoption on the part of the industry. And so this pilot, to the extent that we can link the fact that we have reality in healthcare in terms of access to information via portal and federation issues that have been brought to the fore in the last 2 years by the work on direct, linking these to the patient-centered shift that privacy on fire represents and the consent use case, if you want to call it that, would accelerate things immensely. So rather than dealing with this pilot as, gee, we're reinventing everything, which from a protocol perspective we are, FHIR itself, OAuth, OpenID Connect, and UMA, if we could link the work of this pilot to what's already mandated for the work that ONC has been doing for 4+ years, we would move along much more quickly.
And for those of you who are implementers, it's one thing to define a standard and to implement what you believe is the standard. And then when it comes to interoperability across these different different actors, I mean, that is where I think the real work needs to happen. That is where we're going to really see what interoperability is all about. And then until we do that, I just think it's still a vision until we can actually get some real work around it.
Thank you.
Tom.
Again, Tom Sullivan. I wanted to point out some of the really gigantic influences that are changing healthcare. You heard a little bit earlier of the laws, but also one that we haven't talked about, or two that we haven't talked about, and that's the change in the method of employment of physicians, or how physicians are working nowadays seeing patients. 15 years ago, in Massachusetts, 59% of our 25,000 or so, close to 30,000, depending on how you count them, physicians were employed, 59%, and the average for the nation was 39% were employed in large practices, hospitals. Today in Massachusetts, 75% of physicians are employed. I don't know what the national average is, but I'm pretty sure it's going up. And the reason I bring that up is because, as everybody knows, medicine is becoming a bigger and bigger business, and it seems like there's a tension between a profession and a business that's like any other kind of commerce. And I can tell you that physicians feel that they're losing their autonomy and they're losing their independence, and you know, they don't feel like they necessarily have the ability to treat the individual patient first. They have to look more at populations, and they have to look at corporate directives. And the reason I'm bringing that up is Adrian and I and Debbie, we worked on this healthcare use case, which is up on our wiki, in which we said, you know, there are issues of how you use identity to manage your record. And we allowed for the case of pseudonyms and having a certain amount of anonymity in terms of multiple identities. But we also recognized in the use case, and you can, as I said, you can see it on the wiki, it's fairly short, that it may be that the physician who was presented with a patient who says, you know, I have more than one identity in healthcare, and the reason is I have records that I want segregated. I don't believe that your system can protect me adequately against breaches. So we allow that right to the patient in our use case, but we also say that the physician who's treating may be under an obligation either by law or corporate policy that they can't take care of a person who is unwilling to share their appropriate medical history. And so we've said in our use case, in some cases, the institution, the enterprise, is going to say, you know what, if this person doesn't have a life-threatening emergency, they better go somewhere else to see another physician, because we can't accept the liability. And I'm bringing up the issue of professional liability. That's one of the things that distinguishes healthcare and medicine from banking and other industries. There are a few other things that distinguish us from other kinds of commerce, but it's present in most physicians' minds, the issue of professional liability, malpractice, tort issues, and the need to know everything. As the National Library of Medicine they had a little turn on words. You've probably heard the saying, the more you know, the better you feel. Well, I remember the National Library of Medicine saying, the more you know, the better you heal. And, you know, the idea is you got to know everything. You got to keep up with the literature. So I'm presenting that long-winded situation as these are some of the influences that are changing the way physicians feel about the practice of medicine and how medicine is being practiced. That corporate policy, that corporate law, and the fear of liability are interfering with autonomy and independence, and to some extent the situation where a person presents with multiple identities. And I leave that open. That may be just a big theoretical conundrum, but I'd love to hear any comments on.
Well, I remember, Tom, when I guess we were all sitting at that workshop at MIT, and I deliberately put myself in there because I'm not a health policy expert, but I felt like the more I learn, the less I know. And what occurs to me is that I think our whole notion of physician is changing. I don't know that a physician in the future will be a person. Some of you may have heard today's announcement from Samsung that the new generation of phones will have 5 different more high-definition cameras on the phone. And that allows them to present video to you and direct the imaging on the phone to you as you move your face. Now we have a diagnostic tool that we have very little knowledge of where it fits into these systems and who owns the data that comes from that wonderful experience of a Samsung phone where the definition in the video that you're looking at is equal to the definition in video that you're providing to it. Whose data is that? What prescriptions or judgments can be made about your state of health or the medicine that you're taking from the payload from those phones back to the system that sits behind it?
I'm just going to make a very quick comment about Tom's point. I think all of us are well aware of the troubles with the VA's waiting list issues. And my point there being how much of what we're doing here would have avoided that kind of an issue where the veterans, the physicians, and the institution are not working from the same playbook because the data, even with Blue Button and the huge advances that have been made in the VA system that we've already mentioned, the data is out there to be found. The physicians are incredibly dedicated, all of the ones that I know, and the patients have lots of advocates, but the data isn't flowing. And if the data were to flow, if notice and interoperability were solved, the kind of issues that we saw very broadly would really not be happening simply because of sunshine.
I struggle with the gray area. For an example, with attributes, where does identity and attributes for healthcare maintenance pickup or something like that? And when I hear you talk about your concerns, I think of who owns the data and what is the provenance around the data and which is far more complicated. It's complex. It's not just an identity issue, but it's much more greater than that. And I don't see that being solved here, but I just think that's something that we need to be mindful of going forward for that. I think a patient's right to their information and their data. What is their data? I think in the data personal data space, I think they've investigated that. That possibly there is some data that you don't know, but I just think that's a broader concern.
One of the things that we're going to do next week at the University of Washington at the next in this series of the economics of identity is to talk about big data, talk about the provenance of it, and the role of IPR in big data. Because we don't know exactly what to call these attributes. Peter Alterman used to like to say that identity is a name on a bag with a bunch of attributes in it. And I think that's probably a good way of thinking about it. But the question is, we're releasing more and more data into the system with little governance beyond IPR, because IPR links to the value of that data, the value of the data about me to my insurance company, the value of the data as it flows to my physician and other systems. And we simply are in kind of the wild, wild west when it comes to synchronizing the availability of data and the governance and privacy and security thereof.
Kim, should we check online for questions?
Yeah, I have those questions. So, perfect timing. This question comes from Anne Rakuya Robbins. It's to Debbie. How can we learn more about the patient-centric models and policies, and how can people participate in development of the model?
That's a very good question.
I think the HIMSS folks have done a good job in that regard.
And also, so the Blue Button effort we were talking about originated out of what they call the ONC S&I framework. There was an initiative that it started from there. I don't know if it's active. There's a very large consumer engagement piece that's from ONC, that if there is true want to participate and engage, I would suggest that would be the first place to start, because they have the broader vision and picture of that. And I think it would be great. I think they would like to hear from folks that want to be more involved.
And I'll put a quick pitch in for patient privacy rights. Patient privacy rights is a coalition representing dozens of groups across a very, very broad social spectrum. It's about 10 million people. And patient groups, or patients for that matter, that want to be involved in some of this stuff, to the extent that patient privacy rights is involved, should join in.
I have one other question. How does HHS use the term identity? And if so, how is it different from INSTIC and IDSG use of it?
Isn't that, I'm a little confused about that question. Isn't that the whole idea of the IDSG? Isn't there the recognition that there is a common understanding around what identity is? That there's more commonalities than difference. So I'm not sure.
So while this was not my
if
question,
there's a uniqueness. There may be some policies and regulations and behind of it. Just this is a personal, I don't know HHS's point of view. Identity is identity, so I'm not sure.
As far as I know,
response.
identity doesn't show up in any meaningful way in the high-tech
Right.
or ACA-related regulations. I could be wrong, but nothing jumps to mind.
What jumps to my mind is a similar trope, which is I can't define identity, but I know it when I see it.
I think for me, from a plenary chair perspective, when their presentations were made yesterday from the security committee, and if you recall, the taxonomy work group was between standards and security, has been kind of put on hold for a bit. There's still great need for that work, and maybe this will be one of those little small scenarios where we can think of, have we collected all the definitions, if they exist, for identity within even the use cases that we have been working on, just to show that I doubt that there is common usage of even that word. So.
Again, at the risk of repeating myself, I would point HHS and all of us to the healthcare use case, because it is really a pivotal piece of work in a carefully done across a number of stakeholders that does provide this link, I think, for the first time. And it was done in the context of IDSG, which means that it inherits the privacy protections and the governance benefits of the stuff that we're doing here right now.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Are we at 10? Another 15 minutes? Oh, great. Peter, I see, patiently waiting.
Hello there. Yeah. My comment actually follows up very much this on this thread on Don's allusion to Peter's comment about this sort of bag with a label on. last year I was working with Joan McNabb in California, obviously one of the big privacy advocates in the Attorney General's office, on a project on medical ID theft and guides to HIEs and to practitioners on how to identify and how to resolve problems around a medical ID theft. One of the things that came up, which was very interesting and a sad testament in a way, is that certainly in California, a very large proportion of medical ID theft, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think it's something over 2/3, were committed in a sort of benign manner, in the sense of one member of a household not being covered by medical insurance, borrowing the identity, either knowing in the full knowledge of or without the knowledge of an insured person in the household in order to get some medical treatment. Now, aside from all the questions about what that means in terms of the health insurance system and about the theft committed, one of the consequences of this was what they called sort of pollution of records. And you can imagine a situation, someone with an emergency situation gets treatment in the name of their brother or an uncle or somebody else in the family, manages to pass them off as this other person, but now that other person's medical record is polluted with information about this other, the second person's, the fraudsters, if you like, medical information, in a way that could actually be life-threatening to the first person, because they're either prescribed with medication or contraindicated in their records for treatment by something that in other situations would help them. And I think the problem came up here was, how do you manage, and this is back to Don's point about the sort of big data and analytics point of view, how can we help the unbundling of those different bits of data which, once a infected record, if you like, has been identified, that this has been fraud that's been committed, how can you help unbundle that whole medical record to identify which parts were actually and should be attributed to person A rather than person B, if the full history of how that information has been entered and recorded has not been able to be immediately identified. I think there's an analytics problem, because you might be able to trace certain patterns which enable you to unbundle that. It may be through timestamping and everything else, but I'm just wondering that this adds that level of complexity in terms of the issue of the identity of the patient, when in fact from a polluted record point of view, it's actually representing information from more than one source.
Well, this was actually, we started getting into this in the joint privacy, healthcare, birds of a feather session or whatever yesterday. What you're describing, and it's a very beautiful use case, is who owns the record, who owns the responsibility, who is accountable, who is liable, as Tom mentioned, for what is going on. And healthcare is a very rich place to consider these issues. I'll give you my personal opinion, is that in healthcare we have the benefit of two governance or two regulatory methods. One of them is the institutional one, which is the one we often think of when we talk about the standards and the things that we put in place. And the other one is the physician licensure, as Tom mentioned in his introduction. These are parallel systems. They're not quite orthogonal, but so we have two bites at the apple from a privacy or a user-centered perspective. One of them is, will patients trust their physician to manage the sorting out of these issues relative to how things are being paid, or the reason that they committed this intentional fraud on the payer or on the institution, if you want to call it that. So it's a complicated problem, and it gets to the very heart of the privacy issues that we have to solve if we are to have a prayer of getting to big data or to scalable systems on the scale that we're talking about with the cybersecurity issues. So all I'm saying is pay attention to the family as an agent, the professional, the licensed professional as an agent, and the institution as an agent, because they all have a role to play that we need to consider in the governance and the things that we do.
I guess from my perspective, pay attention to the elevation of trust, the standards around how we move trust up and down the LOA ladder. Pay attention to trust marks, because they are the memes that this trust will be embodied. As we have the blue button in the VA and that little F for Facebook, those trust marks are incredibly powerful. Pay attention to this pilot that Debbie is teasing us about, and particularly how user consent and permissioning is defined in the context of an open standard, whether it be for healthcare or for the device of platform of choice and mobility. Pay attention to those pivot points. And I would suggest in closing that we had a similar discussion last week and Monday in London. Kim and Mike Garcia, Jeremy, and a bunch of folks were there. And the Right Honorable Francis Maude, who reports to the Prime Minister, summed up his perspective in 4 letters or 4 initials, which was JFDI, just flip and do it. And that's my approach, which is let's just do some stuff. Let's look at these places that both Adrian and I have said are the pivot points. Pick one and JFDI.
So I distinctly think what you're expressing is possibly a patient safety issue at the point of care, to know that the information that you're getting is truly for the patient that you're treating. And that is a huge risk. And that makes it more important for the confidence level of knowing the identity of that patient that you're truly treating, right? So, I mean, point well taken. No solutions, but point well taken.
We have a question here. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Bill Whitescarver with Proof and Secure Solutions and Ping 360 US. And I've heard a lot about consent, and we talked about patient consent here today. And Adrian, you mentioned the RLS, the Relationship Locator Service. And that's very interesting to me, because it seems like there's a link between that and possibly, building a profile of patient consent. So what I'd like to know is what has been done with RLS, and what's the status of that type of a mechanism?
2 things. First of all, RLS is a fact of life. It's there are somewhere, I don't know, 50 to 80 public or regional health information exchanges in the country. There are hundreds of private exchanges that all of them operate patient matching or primary identity management services for the purpose of record locators. So there is a huge amount that's just active in that area. So the problem with the way RLS operates today is that it is opaque to the patient. And as with any database that is opaque to the actual individual, it is fraught with errors and also with suspicion in some cases. There is absolutely no consensus, even though RLS is such a ubiquitous component of healthcare right now. There is actually no consensus, either regulatory or otherwise, as to how these things should be done. And it is becoming urgent. And ONC ran an entire fact-finding set of research and an all-day session around how to improve patient matching, and wrote it up. It's all an open issue. Let me say the other thing that I think is very relevant to this group about RLS, which is that in order to populate an RLS, you have to have some concept of federation, which otherwise doesn't exist in commerce or healthcare especially, because by definition, you are populating a database, a directory, which will then be able to be queried by somebody else. And so you're moving the data from the relying party to the RLS under some kind of federation agreement, whether the consent is explicit, opt-in, opt-out, whether it was captured on paper or digitally with OAuth or with anything else, it doesn't really matter. You are involved in a federation. And the question then becomes, how do we link identity federation, which in effect deals with the problem that Joy clearly mentioned about how do you take a right of access to the contents of that aggregator or that lab, it doesn't really matter, as an identity federation issue, OpenID Connect being the standard that now nobody debates is going to be what it is that's going to be done. And how do you link that federation to the consent federation that, however it's done, opt-in, opt-out, state issues, business issues, then why are those two federations different? They're two institutions, right? They're two governance mechanisms. They should follow. If our work is broad enough to shed clarity on this relationship between consent federation, that's part of everyday industry. It's part of a credit card, cash machine network in finance, to identity, then what we're trying to achieve with cybersecurity and the fundamental privacy issues will be a lot easier because it'll make sense to people that these things are linked. And right now they're not.
Yet, in the private sector, in massive big data identity places, Jeremy was on a panel last week at the EMA conference where Kim Cameron of Microsoft announced that Microsoft will federate with one of its biggest competitors, Salesforce.com. And I think it's fair to say that the next one in that pipeline would be a federation between Salesforce, Microsoft, and SAP. Massive data repositories being federated using OpenID Connect as its base tool. So they can figure it out, or they're beginning to figure it out. The notion that we have to federate with our competitors for the benefit of all, and the notion of that federation is it's instantiated in a trust framework. So how do we remove the opacity of each of those individuals and create transparency for the trust framework that binds them together in technical, legal, and business ways? One of the things that we hope to do at OIX is to create a registry so that trust frameworks can be registered and can be made more transparent so that you can do a read across of interoperability and most importantly of the privacy protections afforded in those federations. So it's happening today. It's happening in these mammoth companies. They're doing it not for any great social good, but they see that they must federate, they must use open standards, and they must maintain the trust between their customers, much in the same way that in healthcare we need to maintain the trust between the doctor and the patient systems that surround that relationship.
Well, I think we'll conclude. So thanks again to our panelists for participating and sharing these insights on this important work. Thanks again to Joy for outlining the vision at ONC. And I'd like to reiterate the call to action I think we heard for the IDSG to address this more thoroughly and help develop solutions that could help this critical space. And I think going forward, the ongoing interaction in the healthcare community between ONC initiatives, the great work that Debbie is doing, and key stakeholders and communities, leveraging great standards, I think is going to be a great point of collaboration here going forward, and calling on what Kim said as we look to what can be accomplished here and under the leadership of the IDSG going forward, I think there's great potential, very exciting. So expect to hear more from us and from ONC and others in future plenaries and activities going forward. So on that note, thanks again, and JFDI.
Thanks, Jim and panel, for having such a lively conversation and for all the questions that were presented. So we actually have time for a break now. So for the next 15 minutes, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to have a presentation on the standards adoption process and try to have the user experience charter approved. Thank you. Agenda is a presentation on the standards adoption process. This is kind of really the first part in terms of the presentation. There'll be more in subsequent either online or in-person conversations. So, Kathy?
So it's good to see you stalwarts still in the audience here. I got to figure out how to advance slides. I think I bet
it's this one right here. Try that.
Yeah, go ahead. No.
That's a loser.
Ah.
Oh, magic.
All right, so we're here to talk to you today about the standards adoption policy that we've developed. Where do I point it?
Just click it, see what happens.
I did.
No clicking.
There
we go.
Okay, so our purpose is to really to provide awareness and an overview of the draft policy. We're not going to be able in 30 minutes to go deep into the details. We're hoping that you'll actually, once you've learned a little bit about it, we'll actually go out and pull it down and look at the details yourself. So we'll start with an introduction, talk a little bit about the status, give you the overview, and then a little bit about our plans and next steps. So, adopted standards form part of the identity ecosystem framework, inform the work of the IDESG committees, and will be relied upon as part of any Trustmark program. So that's what this standards adoption is all about. Why do we have to have a standards adoption process? Because we have to have a way of determining which standards become part of the identity ecosystem framework and which ones do not. So it's the purpose of this policy, what we have been calling the SAP, the Standards Adoption Policy, to define the policies and processes for doing just that. So we started working on this about a year ago, actually over a year ago. Jamie reminds me of that frequently. And we started with a draft of the standards criteria document. Jamie's been leading this effort on behalf of the Standards Coordination Committee and is acting as the editor of the document and leader of the drafting team. In January, this past January plenary, we had a breakout, and as a result of that breakout, we developed an outline for the document as well as some of the key elements of it, in particular some of the process flows and a plan, put a plan in place for the development of the policy. Since then, we've had multiple iterations of the documents, different review and comment periods internal to the standards committee. But at this point, we feel like we have a complete document and that it is ready for committee review. And so we will be beginning a 30-day review period for all of the various IDESG committees to have an opportunity to take a look at it and give us your feedback on it. So what is contained in the document? We have 5 major parts of it. The introduction, which really lays the groundwork for the role of standards within the IDESG and within the identity ecosystem framework. We have our policy statements. Then we go through what is the adoption process, what are the criteria that we use, and then there's some informative appendices. Okay, one thing I wanted to make clear is you may have heard me speak yesterday in the committee report out about the standards inventory. And I want to make it very clear that there are two different things that we're talking about, and both of them are mentioned in the policy document. One is the standards inventory that I mentioned yesterday, and the other one is the standards repository. And it's very easy to get confused when we're referring to these two things. So the standards inventory is a catalog of existing identity-related standards. It's just a list that is available for reference. It's hosted on the wiki, so anybody with an IDESG logon can add to that repository, and then it becomes a resource for committees, and it's a source for standards nominations. So if a standard gets nominated for adoption, it needs to have been first inserted into the inventory. But that inventory doesn't, imply any kind of endorsement or adoption status. It's just a listing. Now, the standards registry, on the other hand, is an official part of the identity ecosystem framework, as I mentioned. It contains all of the standards that have been formally adopted by the IDESG, and the content is the result of a documented process and including plenary approval. So this is the official list of adopted standards.
Actually, Kathy, before we leave that one point, let's put in a solicitation on behalf of the Standards Committee to all of you. The left-hand bag is supposed to be a big bag. Standards, proposed standards, specifications, stuff we don't know about yet. We strongly encourage anyone participating in IDSG to go into that wiki and tell us stuff we don't know, because we want to cast the broadest possible net. The stuff that's currently contained in the smaller right-hand bag is 0 right now because this plenary has not approved anything yet. But we don't get to that unless we get stuff in the big bag. So help us fill the big bag.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, so when we talk about the standards adoption policy, we have 6 policy statements that are contained in the document. And what we've done is we've included a policy statement, and then there's some more description of that policy, but these are the big 6. First of all, we just confirm that neither the IDESG nor the SCC is a standards developer. We actually had the term SDO in there at one time, but we had some that took objection to the term SDO, so we made it more generic and just refer to standards developers. So we do not intend to be a standards developer. In fact, the ROA tells us we are not to be an SDO. Similarly, however, we will work with standards developers for standards availability for our purposes. The IDSG will establish suitability criteria for standards adoption, and in fact, that's what Section 4 of the document is intended to do. The SCC will oversee the process for standards adoption and will be the primary point of contact for standards developer or SDO liaison. And lastly, only adopted standards will be normatively referenced within official IDESG work products and within the identity ecosystem framework. So, for example, what does that mean to you as a committee? What that would mean is that if you're creating a work product, whether it's a trust mark or it's something else that is meant to be formally adopted by the plenary, and in there you normatively reference a standard, that standard needs to have gone through the adoption process so that it's already in the bucket. Maybe not at the time that you draft the work product, but by the time the work product is approved. So that's an important aspect that, and we are interested in feedback on that. Okay, one of the main elements of the standards adoption policy is the standards adoption life cycle, and you may recognize this colorful, column chart because we did something similar for the use case life cycle. In this case, we've tailored it specifically for the standards adoption policy. So the first bucket is or column is the standards inventory. Already talked about that a little bit. The second column is for standards revision or development. We already said we're not going to do that. However, we may, in the course of our work, identify standards requirements for which an existing standard either does not exist at all, or that standard, there is a standard, but it doesn't meet 100% of our requirements. Maybe it's 85% there, but with revision or extension, it could meet our requirements. And so this is the process of how you identify those gaps and how you go about filling those gaps by working with the standard developing organizations. And then once, let's say you've gone through that process, you've created a project proposal, and now you have it's come out the other end of that process, then it would be nominated and go through the rest of the remaining process. Which gets us to the third column, which is standards nomination. So for standards that we have identified as useful to us, that we want to include in our framework, it would go through just a nomination process, so that it would be nominated by, in general, it would come from the various other committees of IDESG, but it's not limited to them. It can be any stakeholder, can nominate a standard to be adopted. Then it would go through a review process within the SCC, where we would apply the criteria that I mentioned, and which Jamie will talk more about in a bit. It would go through the formal adoption process, and then become, and if it is approved by the plenary, it would then be entered into the standards registry, and that standards registry, of course, being part of the IDEF. And then there's once it's approved, it's there. There is a process for removing or updating standards after that point. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie for any further remarks on this and to take you through the more details of the policy.
See if I can run this thing. Good morning. We're going to hit two of the spots on that chart in detail. First of all, the chart that Kathy just showed you is in the policy draft. That means you can comment on it, and we hope you will help us improve it. So is this one, and this is at least our first hardened stab at a flow diagram for what actually happens. I'm going to concentrate mostly on the top, on that square that still says SDOs. We got to correct that one. On the middle right margin, and then in the filtering process that occurs below that. Up at the top is essentially the point that Kathy made in her life cycle description. We're going to be looking for stuff that needs standards. They may not be standards yet. They may be specifications. They may not even be specifications. They may be requirements or use cases or gaps. And as any process, including in any of the IDSG committees, identifies something that should be standards-based, because the national strategy tells us we are in a standards-based strategy, then we're hoping to catch and note that. If we catch and note it at a point where there aren't any good candidates to solve it yet, then we'll be having the kinds of discussions that Kathy was indicating, which have to do with gaps, and we're going to hit that comment in a minute, and then we're going to come down after talking about gaps to sort of the filtering criteria for what happens when we actually find one and want to look at it more closely. Here's the gap strategy, and I'm not going to read the slide to you, but here's the general idea. When projects in or near the IDSG discover that there is a functionality that would be solvable by an open standard, and we either need one, or there are a couple of them, but they aren't quite there, or we need a profile of one, it is the proposition of this policy that someone who is the owner of that problem, privacy problem from the privacy committee, healthcare problem from the health community, etc. Pilots who end up with discovering that some of the standards we thought would help them don't help them quite the way they thought they would. And this has already happened. We've already received some feedback. Say, nice standard, but we plugged it in and we can't get there from here. Can you help us out? Or can you go tell the authority that created the standard that they need to pave the last 10 miles of the road? When that happens, the basic proposition of the policy is that the standards committee will error trap and discover that, and then lead a process to create some kind of a project description for how to fix or fill or address the gap. We'll then engage in conversations with one or more standards developers. Doesn't always have to be one. This isn't a survival of the fittest thing. But basically, we'll identify some standards sources that might be able to help out, take comment on who they might be and what we might be asking them to do, and then basically this will represent the IDSG through its standards committee, sending a project off to them to ask for them to make a standard, improve a standard, profile a standard, pave that, fix that gap, etc. So that's the basic idea of gap identification. Please look at what we've written, because there's assumptions in there about how we'll do it, how we would describe it, how we would choose to send it to one or more parties, and on what kind of time schedule, and your feedback in that would be very important.
I just want to mention that if you heard the committee report out yesterday, we talked about a proposal that we've already received from the pilots related to KBA performance metrics. And so this is exactly, a stakeholder input that we received, identifying a specific gap and looking for us to help them go through that process.
And one of the great things about our friends doing the pilots is that they're out there actually trying to do this stuff and bloodying their nose against the wall when all the things we thought would fulfill their needs don't get there. So we're kind of taking it from standard that we think is going to work great on a test bench to real-world experience, and often it's the pilots that are bringing the information back to us that we might need to do a little something more. So we want the IDSG to be an engine for noticing and fixing those problems, and that's our idea. Here is a summary of what is said in the policy about finding one or more standards organizations to fulfill those proposals, but essentially the proposal is that we broker that within the Standards Committee. So please give us your comments. Now, once we get to, actually, you know what, will this thing go back? Is it that smart?
Yeah, it's good. There's a back button.
Yeah, give me a second. Let's see if I can actually make this technology work for me. Okay. We just did that bit way up there. Now we're going down. And sooner or later, someone will bring us a standard or a specification or a method that could be a standard someday, and they will say to us, we think this thing is the cat's pajamas, and we think that it is the best possible authentication standard, the best possible assurance framework standard for defining a certain kind of trust network, or the best possible standard for heaven only knows what. At that point, the Standards Committee is going to be tasked with the problem of saying something intelligible to the plenary so that the plenary can decide whether they're going to endorse it. That's how you get from that big bucket to the small bucket of endorsed stuff. Now, let me tell you something. I work professionally for a standards developer, Oasis. We worked very closely with the project a couple of years ago initiated by NIST called the SGIP, which was about smart grid standards, that had some of these same characteristics of a industry, academic, and government community trying to come together to solve a whole architecture in a particular area. And we had 3 or 4 standards projects at Oasis as an SDO that were addressing smart grid stuff. We went through a process very much like this, and at the end of it, after running a lot of gauntlets and a lot of debates, 3 of our standards, which were developed during that period of time, were added to the official SGIP standards catalog. And what I'm going to tell you from Oasis' point of view is we're a big standards organization, and we are pretty capable of getting things promoted and endorsed on our own. But the fact that 3 of our standards became part of the official SGIP standards catalog was a big deal to us in terms of adoption, in terms of the way ANSI recognized it, in terms of the way the industry was interested. So here's what I'm here to tell you, okay? As the IGSG, you have the ability to influence standards that you think fit in the ecology, that are sufficiently open, that are sufficiently workable, that have the attributes you think they ought to have, endorse them as a plenary, and put them in an official registry, and then that is a big deal to the people who create them. So you've got some power there. This is about how to use it. Now, as a matter of context, we're not writing on a blank slate. If you are, for example, in a federal agency in the United States today, you have to cope with a number of criteria, including OMB's Circular A-119, which essentially says, and also the NTTAA legislation, that says if you're going to do something under certain circumstances, you should really use open standards. And an open standard isn't just anything that says, I'm a standard. It's something that has a certain amount of participatory fairness. It has to have certain sorts of characteristics where you can get at it, other people can see it, it's been through a fair process, and so forth and so on. So agencies today, and frankly often they end up making a phone call over to this building to get help on this one because this is a standards bureau here at NIST. They have to make some kind of determination about whether some proposed procedure is sufficiently open and sufficiently standardized to use it in a large public-facing system. Now, the IDSG is not in exactly the same position because we're not just talking about fulfilling government RFPs. We're talking about ecologies which can include a whole bunch of industry work that never touches a government regulation. But we have essentially the same concerns. Is it really an open standard? That's why we have criteria. And, yep, go back one. There we go. This thing takes forever to go backwards. There we go. And so we have developed, proposed, and are offering to you a set of criteria that should be used to assess standards that are brought to you. And that includes an official, ISO standard with lots of pedigrees and stamps on it. That includes a standard from a consortia. That includes something from, a couple of folks in a garage who set themselves up as x.org and say that's now a standard. Everything that you want to use and embrace as an endorsed part of an ecology for this framework can be assessed according to these criteria. Before I talk about the criteria, let me talk about one thing that we didn't really put on the slides, and that is, what do you do with it? What our process suggests, and this is what's open to you for comment, is that essentially somebody who brings that stuff forward should tell us how they think the standard or prospective standard meets these criteria, and then the SCC will convene a meeting and open an opportunity for public and IDESG comment on that question. We will then collect comments, so anybody can say, oh, yeah, geez, SAML or IPv6 or whatever we're talking about. Here's what they say about it, and now I'm going to give comment about that. Is it open? Well, I may think it is, I may think it's not. But basically, there will be a period of comment available for that. And then at the end of that period of comment, the SCC will synthesize and create a report based on those comments, and then that will be part of what the plenary gets, so that when IVP6 or whatever it is comes back later to the plenary for approval, you will have the benefit of having had a period of comment on these criteria. You will have the benefit of the report from the Standards Committee of how it thinks it fits within those criteria, and that will also basically give, incidentally, also some raw material for agencies and others trying to make their own determinations about what the community that commented here thinks about that stuff. So, having said that, let me get through the criteria, and then I think we'll be able to have some time for questions if there are any, right? Okay, they're not going to be surprising to you for the most part. We started with some very obvious criteria that more or less come right out of public policy, okay? If something is an open standard, it should have been conducted in an open environment where anybody can come give comment. It needs to not be a closed club. If something is an open standard, it needs to be conducted under fair rules. In other words, not only can anybody have reasonable access to commenting on it and looking at it and giving feedback, but also there's a reasonable chance that their comment will be heard and that there will be some kind of process around it so we can tell that it wasn't just done in a smoke-filled room with 3 people at the end. There needs to be some transparency. In other words, while all this is going on, there should be relatively reliable ways to find out what's happening. And also, later, when it's approved, a person who is proposing to use it or trying to figure out whether they like it or not should be able to go back and look at some kind of record to discover what the people who made it did. So it needs that kind of transparency as well. Function-oriented description is not a very elegant phrase. I don't know, we tried and couldn't find a better phrase, and you're warmly welcome to help us find a better phrase. But it's a very clear concept in standards work, and that is a standard needs to be something that fulfills a specific function. In other words, if I say, this is a thing that works like the widget made by Foo Company, that's not a function-oriented description. That's a make it like Foo Company's description. That's a product-oriented description. A functional-oriented description says, here is a thing that has the following 3 or 4 features and works this way. That is necessary if you're going to allow more than one commercial entity to have an equal chance at building things. You need to not reference things in terms of existing products. So it's got to have that attribute or it's not a standard. Now, we've got a couple other criteria we're going to talk about, and I'll mention these 2 last because these are, I think, special to the IDESG, and we added them later in the process. If you were listening to our work in December of last year, you wouldn't have picked up these 2. They came in through comments and assistance from the drafting committee later on. One is affordability, and the other is relevance, and they're both important, and again, we're soliciting your comment on these things. Affordability doesn't necessarily mean that everything always has to be completely without any cost whatsoever. Different entities and different agencies and different academic institutions have different rules about what it costs to participate in a process, what it costs to acquire copies of a document at draft time or in its final form, whether there are royalties or not. These are all pretty widely debated questions. But what is absolutely clear to us, and what we tried to write carefully into the policy, is that a standard that is expected to be widely used within an ecosystem that includes a large number of folks, including consumers, isn't going to work well or be embraced if the use of it drives the cost up to where it's not, it's out of the reach of the people we're expecting to embrace it. Now, there's going to be some data standards, including procedures, including business processes, that are only implemented by a small number of really large entities like certifiers or giant server ISPs or something like that. The cost issue there could be different than the cost issue for something that is expected to show up on, say, every mobile phone on Earth or be a part of the practice of every consumer owning a smart thermostat on Earth. So we have different cost considerations in different places, and we had robust debate about that, and I'm sure that will continue. But remember, what we're doing in this is trying to propose a criterion so that each time this comes up, as a standard is proposed, there's an opportunity for comment. Please take a look and tell us if you think we've done a good job with that criteria. The other one, which is a little open-ended, but we decided is essential, is relevance, and we specifically mean relevance to the guiding principles in the national strategy. If something comes along and is inserted as a candidate in this system, and it seems to be completely orthogonal to the whole purpose of the IDSG, or it's so out of touch with what the guiding principles of the national strategy suggest that it probably doesn't belong in our ecosystem, we wanted to give a catch-all opportunity for a commenter to point that out. That's what that's doing there.
Just to add to that, there's actually two parts of the relevance criteria. One has to do with exactly what Jamie said, the consistency with the guiding principles. The second one is that it really needs to relate to identity in some way or to the work that we're doing. So, for example, we wouldn't be looking at standards for distance between screw threads or something like that.
So help us out, take a look, and see if you think we got it right. But also, just technically, as a prospective participant in this process later on, when you're commenting on a standard that's being proposed, see if those criteria are helpful to you. Ask yourself, if I had to answer, what do I think, does this tell me enough for me to reach an opinion and give meaningful feedback to an evaluation process? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but I will say that there are also a couple of sort of secondary derived requirements which are important that follow from those first principles, and we have also described them. For example, we are taking the position that any of those processes, in order to be open, fair, et cetera, need some kind of minimum public review period. There needs to be a demonstration that it wasn't just done in a closed room. We think that part of the process of being an open standards organization and a reliable open standard is that there are stable hosting requirements. In other words, if there's a great idea stood up by Joe, Fred, and Kathy.com, and then Joe, Fred, and Kathy split up later and start other organizations, and the website Joe, Kathy, and Fred.com goes away, you have a problem if that's your authenticated source for the standard. So you need to know that it's going to be there, and it's going to stay there, and there's some kind of persistent arrangement. Now, in the past, it has often been the position of the federal government that they want to see a well-established, reliable, long-standing organization behind that because that's the only assurance they have that the thing is going to stick around and that it's been vetted enough and stable enough to be used. Is that going to be our future? Well, honestly, we think that's a question that is up for grabs in our current environment. So that's something we want to comment on. Finally, there's got to be clear intellectual property rules. If people who use this thing don't know if they can readily license it or what the terms are or what the risks are, they're not going to use it. So there needs to be a very clear IPR structure. They could be different from host to host, but there needs to be one. Last wrap-up item, and then I'm going to give you some metadata and turn it back over to Kathy in questions. We have also taken a careful approach on which we solicit your comment to the idea that there will be projects coming through the mill that aren't approved standards yet, and that's probably okay sometimes. KBA is an example. We had 3 or 4 of the pilots saying, gee, we're using KBA, and it isn't necessarily fully standardized, or it doesn't come from a source so we know we can rely, but we kind of like to use it, and how do you guys feel about that? Well, one of the ways that the IDSG generally could approach that is swat it down, say, nope, isn't official yet, doesn't have a gold stamp, go away, be quiet. Or we could say, let's evaluate it according to the criteria that are appropriate. Let's conduct the analysis. Let's agree that some of the things that we expect it to do eventually, like be in a permanent location and have complete openness and have been vetted by the entire public, may not have occurred yet, but let's extract a promise out of them that once they're done and if this thing works out and we decide we want to continue using it in the ecosystem, that they will commit it to some full open standardization process in some way so that we feel good that it's on the path to standardization. And in that case, yes, as an early stage piece of work, we're happy to have it used for now. So this early stage techniques section is something we'd solicit your comment on because it suggests that we want to have an on-ramp for incoming projects that will standardize, that are getting there, but without requiring that everything always be done before we even sanction it or talk about it. And with that, let me just give you this much metadata. In addition to Kathy Tilton here from DAON, who is wonderful and did a lot of the heavy lifting for the drafting, as well as being the chair of the Standards Committee, our drafting committee also included Ann Rakuya Robbins, Sal D'Agostino, and Andrew Hatter. And we're talking about people who met for a 2-hour meeting and then said, gosh, we need another 2-hour meeting, and that meant for another 2-hour meeting. And really, they put hours and hours and hours of this over months, and particularly in the last month, everybody worked like a dog to get a draft fully vetted, go through pages and pages of log comments, and do good work. So thanks to all of the members of the drafting committee for bringing us this. However, we still want your comment. It could be better, and we'll look forward to hearing what the committees have to say about it.
So I agree with Jamie, and just add that he was really the impetus and the source of all knowledge for us going forward. So plans and next steps. I mentioned that we're looking at a 30-day review. This is nominally the period that we're looking at. However, it's actually ready now and posted on the website. I'm probably going to send out the invitation to the chairs list tonight or tomorrow. So we'll start early, keep the same end date. This is going to all IDESG committees, and the purpose is to ensure that the committee input is considered and before we get into the formal approval process, not after. And this includes, a first look by the Privacy Committee as well. So the way this happens is I send it to the chairs list. We're looking for the committee chairs to then forward that to their membership and include it on one of their agendas, so that they can work over this 30-day period to get us some comments back. So what I'm telling you is that you're probably not going to see an invitation into your personal mailbox directly. It will come through the committees. Then, of course, once we get those comments in, we'll go through a formal disposition of comments process, similar to what we did within the committee. Then it'll go through the SEC work product approval process, and then into the formal approval process as per the rules of association, which includes the formal now Privacy Committee review, submission to the Management Council, and plenary approval. So that is our path forward. Looking forward to your participation in that. Thanks much. I'm thinking we don't have time for questions. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy and Jamie. Next is to have our conversation around the user experience charter. And if I can have Steve Bruck come up.
Good morning. I told you yesterday that you would have the opportunity to talk about the user experience charter. Here we are. Next slide. Does this work? Was that me, actually? Do you want to go back to agenda then? Okay, we'll just do it manually. Okay, my name is Steve Bruck. I'm the secretary of the User Experience Committee, and I'm filling in for Mary Hauter, who can't be here today. She's in California, but she's doing a great job, as I mentioned yesterday. How much time do we have? 10. Okay, very quickly. Give you some history about the evolution of this charter. I want to give you a summary of our key provisions, a walkthrough if necessary. We may not have time for that, but if you want it, we'll do it. The charter has been up on the IDESG file system since, I think, early June, actually May 28th. And so we have a review of the comments that we've received and our response to those, and then we can proceed to the consensus process. Next slide. So the charter development for this particular committee began back in 2012, and I think one of the key reasons for its stalling was that the committee at that time was struggling with many unanswered questions regarding how certain provisions should be structured. What we did as a first step in revising this charter was to look at all of the other charters that had been approved and among ourselves take a close look at how each of those charters weighed in on things like membership, quorum, voting, things that really drive the organization of the committee and the business rules. So here you see our general process. As a group, we reached our own internal consensus based on that review of the other charters, sent it to the Management Council for their review. They came back with a particular comment regarding scope and focus on human users. We made that adjustment. We then resubmitted it, and it was then recommended by the Management Council for approval and sent out to the plenary in late May. I don't want to read this. I think the takeaway from this, and I think the comment that we incorporated from the Management Council is in the last sentence of the first block, which is essentially to say that, hey, we're talking about human beings. I don't think that that was stressed enough, and we made that change. I think everybody was in agreement that that was a valuable adjustment. So in terms of key provisions of the charter, membership, all members and associates of IDESG, the decision-making process will be consistent with that described in the Rules of Association, which is consensus-based. Voting will be used when we cannot reach consensus and for the purposes of elections. For voting, you need to be an IDESG member, and we don't have a provision for quorum. I think a lot of how we weighed in on these operational and business rules were just a very practical, common sense approach based on probably the challenges that all committees now face. Okay, we got a few comments. There are 3 on this slide and 2 on the following slide. I want to share with you what we heard on the website and how we responded. The first comment is regarding some verbiage that we included regarding frequency of meetings. If the committee shall meet twice monthly, it will be more than once a month. And the comment back was, well, it is expected to meet twice monthly and shall meet no less than once a month. I think that while the verbiage that we have may be duplicative, it essentially reinforces the spirit that we're going to meet at least twice a month. So we did not make a change there. Second comment regarded, I think, the impression on the commenter that we were using language that might be too strong in Section 3 objectives, where we talk about highest security. And I think that was just in deference to this other guiding principle, I think, would be my take on our approach to that. And so we did not make a change there either. In Section 10A, I think there was some confusion regarding our description of how we would vote, and upon review of that, we left the language as is, and here in the right-hand column you can see, I think, the targets of the comment, the "and" which we did intend to be there, and the word "achieved," which in the subsequent comment on the next page, we did accept that comment. Achieved should be past tense. The very final comment that we received from the plenary during this recent review period, was regarding, I think initially where we talk about scope, and we make a statement to the effect that under objectives, that we will ensure that the identity ecosystem technologies and solutions adopt the principles of usability to facilitate all humans who interact with the ecosystem. And I think the comment was essentially, are we referring to something? Is there an external artifact that we want to give some kind of reference to? And I don't think that we are. I think it was a good question. I think our answer in reacting to the comment has helped the group crystallize our understanding of this statement. You know, if you look at the NSTIC document, the word principle occurs very frequently in that document. I think all we're trying to say is that usability is important and there is no reference to an external artifact. At this time, does anybody have any questions or any comments? Mary, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
And I'm here if you have any questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve, Mary, and committee for getting the charter together. If you recall, there was the impetus for this was actually at the Atlanta Plenary, where we actually had a series of meetings to keep this whole user experience group moving forward and reinvigorated again. And so from now to here, or from then to here, we have now a chance to actually approve a charter. There's a question. Mike's not on yet.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, Jim Fenton. One of the things, and perhaps this came up and I missed it, that we've seen in some of the other committees is that the rules of association have some very long periods for voting and for notice of elections and all that, and I believe that some of the other committees have overridden, have set their own time frames for votes in their charters. Is that in the user experience charter?
It's not in the charter, right?
Basically, generally to shorten the default times because they've been found to be very long.
And just in general, that is something actually that is not consistent across charters for all the committees, and it's something that we're going to have to do some retroactive work across the charters for the different committees that do exist. We had that conversation a bit on the first day when we talked about the security committee and some of the challenges that happened during the election process. So as you were checking to see, do you have that in there?
I would just echo what Kim said, that there is not a lot of consistency among the charters, or there's a lot of variability. We don't have that. We don't have any provision to address that.
Okay. Do you want a provision in order to try and make the election times a little bit more manageable?
So my answer would be that that's a best practice that we need to adopt across all committees, but I would not want to see that to be something that would stop the adoption of this charter. I do think that that is a definite thing that we need to consider in improving.
Here's what I would say. I don't think that anybody here should assume that we're going to provide to you a perfect charter, right? You shouldn't assume that. And the other kind of corollary to that is what we need desperately is a charter that authorizes us, the the User Experience Committee, to do the work, that authorizes us to do the work that we've been doing. So we've been limping along for 2 years plus without this committee, which is desperately needed and really a key guiding principle found within that NSTIC document. This is going to evolve. We're going to make it better, and we will, as all of the other committees do, react to certain challenges that we face, and we will make adjustments.
Peter?
Yeah, sorry, Peter Brown. Yeah, I just echo those sentiments. I think there are two issues here. One is, as Steve rightly underlined, is the importance of having this committee charter adopted. Jim's comment, I think, is also equally valid. It's a separate one, and it's one which we've undertaken to take on as a management council, which I think we've already announced at the last two plenaries, that going forward we need to simplify a lot of the things and make, in terms of our rules of association, there's still inconsistencies, there's still issues which need to be resolved. And I think, although in the initial 2-year period there's inevitably we've been sort of erring on the side of caution in terms of how we organize things, which has meant slowing things down a lot because we want to be absolutely sure we get things right. Now that we have a bit more confidence, we're incorporated, we're starting to get some momentum going, there are certain things which we need to simplify and to make coherent across all committees, and that's the undertaking I'm giving, that is something that's under review. Thanks.
Okay, so in the interest of time, and we are doing an awesome job of staying on time today, so thank you. I'd like to first check to see if are there any comments online? Okay. So we're going to do a consensus voting process. So we'll kind of do the opposite of the approval approach, but say, are there any objections to adopting this charter? And as you heard, a very important component of the IDSG, so that we do have an official user experience committee. So are there any objections in the room or remotely as to adopting the charter? No? Then we consider the charter adopted and we officially have a user experience committee. Thank you. Okay, so now we are in an exciting part of our agenda today. We actually have a wonderful addition to the plenary for today, and I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy to do an introduction of our guest speaker.
Thanks. Well, congratulations to the Usability Committee and, in fact, the whole steering group for finally getting this charter approved. I'm real excited to introduce our next speaker, who is Bruce Andrews. His role is he is the Acting Deputy Secretary of Commerce and, in fact, the nominee to be the permanent Deputy Secretary of Commerce. For those who don't know, when you look at secretaries, deputy secretaries, assistant deputy secretaries, associate secretaries in Washington, he's the #2 guy in charge of the entire Commerce Department, for which NIST reports to. The last guy who was in that role was actually NIST's director, Pat Gallagher. Pat, if you didn't know, left just last week, actually. He's going to be the next chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh. We were really sorry to see him go, but when I heard the news that Bruce was going to be getting the nomination, I was thrilled. He's somebody who's been at Commerce for a few years now. He came in, I think, October of 2011 as Chief of Staff to the Commerce Secretary. Before coming to Commerce, he served in a number of roles, both in Capitol Hill as well as in the private sector. He's somebody who's got a great understanding of the issues that we're dealing with, and I asked if he'd be willing to come up here today in his new role to talk a little bit about where NSTIC fits in with some broader Commerce Department and Obama administration priorities. So with that, I'm real pleased to welcome Bruce Andrews. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. Following Pat Gallagher is a tough act to follow, and many of you have had the opportunity to work with Pat and get to know Pat. So we are sad to miss him, and our loss is actually Pittsburgh's gain. But first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here today. It's been 3 years since President Obama signed the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. And in that time, the need for the secure and robust identity ecosystem envisioned in the NSTIC has only become more urgent and necessary. I want all of you to know that the Department of Commerce is committed to these efforts. That is why I'm here today. And the steering group working on this effort, you are key to making this happen. And to bring together a diverse array of stakeholders who can get this right. And that's truly important. With your leadership, we're poised to develop a framework based on the best expertise from industry and government, and that both to create a framework that we all can support. Organizations can then use it to align policies, technologies, and day-to-day business operations to better protect data and information technology systems. This supports the growth of America's digital economy, which you all are so critical to, and thus critical to the growth of America's overall economy with the important role that it plays. This statement has deep implications for how the federal government should partner more closely with leaders like you. The good news is that President Obama and our administration gets it. At the Commerce Department, our new Open for Business agenda, which Secretary Pritzker came in and led the development of, and I worked very closely with her, is focused on key priorities, and one of those key priorities is driving innovation. We see the NSTIC pilots as an important example of the kind of innovation that we need more of. While NSTIC often gets looked at just as a cybersecurity program, we know that it is something much deeper. In laying out a vision for a market-driven, privacy-enhancing approach to online identity, NSTIC seeks to spur creation of something that not only solves security challenges, but also provides us a foundation to enable other innovations. Take big data, for example, an area that's gotten a great deal of attention recently. Last month, the Big Data Working Group, led by John Podesta in the White House, which Secretary Pritzker was a participant in and the department was very involved with, issued an important report identifying opportunities and challenges in big data surrounding privacy issues. Commerce played an important role, with Secretary Pritzker as a member, in the working group. One key lesson that we drew is that sustained innovation in this space is impossible unless we solve identity. There's no other way to give Americans more control over what information they share online, how they share it, and what is done with it. This list of innovations where identity matters is long and will only get longer. From the cloud to e-government, we need to make sure that there's secure and reliable ways to ensure that only the right people are getting to access data or applications. At the Commerce Department, we value our relationship with the companies that have led the way at every stage of the internet revolution, from web browsing and e-commerce to search and social networking. Many of those companies are represented here today. And I can't underscore enough how important that partnership is, because you all understand that the internet is at a crossroads. Protecting security of consumers, businesses, and the internet infrastructure has never been more difficult. Cyber attacks on internet commerce, vital business sector, and government agencies have grown exponentially. And all you need to do is, frankly, pick up the newspaper every day to have that underscored further. And at a time that estimates suggest that 76% of these attacks are executed by taking advantage of our weak password-based systems, the need for better solutions is clear. Likewise, the amount of data gathered on consumers has also grown exponentially. Used appropriately, this data can boost the economy, drive improved online services, and save lives. But we're at a point where we must consider how to best balance the opportunities afforded by this data and the social and ethical questions that arise out of the use of this data. NSTIC is a critical effort to tackle these challenges by working with you, our partners outside of government. It is an effort that looks to do so in a way that protects the tremendous amount of economic and social value of the internet, and that looks at your innovations as the foundation for the effort's success. And this is not only an effort the Commerce Department is engaged in. Since NSTIC was launched, we've undertaken a number of other initiatives, including the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, the Cybersecurity Framework, and as I mentioned earlier, addressing big data and privacy. NSTIC is aligned with and supports the success of all of these initiatives. For the Cybersecurity Initiative, President Obama identified three key principles: that it is based on consensus and best practices in business, that it is flexible and voluntary so that an organization can tailor it to its needs, and that it's developed in a partnership with industry. The President could have been speaking about the identity ecosystem framework in your work here in the steering group as well. We need a tool for that ecosystem that collects existing and proven standard and best practices in identity management while protecting individual privacy and civil liberties, and provides basic guidelines for organizations to adopt those best practices, providing a coherent structure to the many and varied approaches to identity management that have proliferated in recent years. Technology and threats continue to evolve, but trust and accountability do not. For this reason, Secretary Pritzker and I are committed to NSTIC and continuing the good work that you're doing. And we greatly appreciate your commitment to this volunteer effort to improve online trust. Without you, this work would not be possible, so thank you. And thank you for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Secretary Andrews, for the time that you chose to spend with us. And as many of you all can tell, and some people have already started to get up, we are at a great time for our, we're right on time for our lunch break and Birds of a Feather session. So just to kind of wrap up and let you know what we're doing at this time period, there's one Birds of a Feather session that will be on scalable privacy. It's in room 113, which is on this floor. There is also a FICAM meeting that is downstairs in room E. And if you remember again, breadcrumbs, so you can get back there. And there is no food allowed in here. But if you want to go to the cafeteria and bring your food to either one of the locations of the meetings, or if you want to just have some informal Birds of a Feather type sessions, there are tables that are blocked in the cafeteria for you to be able to convene. So at this time, we'll take a break. We'll be back again in this room at 1:15. Thank you.